Okay, so natural theology. What do we mean by natural theology? Well, that's a difficult question, and partly because unlike, say, something like liberation theology or death of God theology, natural theology is not really a particular movement, and it doesn't really have a particular moment of greatest flourishing, although some will argue that for certain moments, but we can maybe come back to that. It's rather, in a sense, a sort of a style of theological thinking. It's a way of doing theology, perhaps. And I think that's important if we want to approach what is always presented as the standard way of defining natural theology. And this, I think, is really enormously problematic for a number of reasons, and yet has become accepted. The first point, really, is that natural theology is standardly defined in contrast to revealed theology. This is the starting point for most discussions of natural theology, that somehow revealed theology is knowledge of God acquired on the basis of God's revelation to humanity. Natural theology, by contrast, is knowledge of God that is somehow arrived at without recourse to revelation. Of course, the moment that one starts to think about this for any length of time, it becomes clear that this is an enormously problematic way of setting things up. I mean, for a start, this rather seems to imply that revelation occurs somehow outside of the natural order, the natural scheme of things, that somehow revealed theology isn't at all situated within or thought about by natural beings. It somehow just breaks into, subverts somehow, or ruptures, or kind of holds up the natural order of things. I mean, and that contrast just really is difficult to see. Even those who want to affirm, the source of theology as lying in some sort of act of divine revelation, the abstraction of that from all natural context just seems problematic. On the other hand, of course, it's very difficult to make sense of the idea of a natural generation of theological thought without at some point there being some notion of this impacting upon, or this coming up with notions of theological thinking that somehow gets out of the normal course of things. Yeah. So that analytically, that contrast seems problematic. Of course, importantly, it's useful to try and see how that definition matches the historical material, and it's just very difficult to find anyone putting forward any form of natural theological thinking on the assumption that this is happening outside of or in contradistinction to revealed theological thinking. Even if it makes sense analytically, it's very difficult to find that historically. Yeah. The other crucial point I think about natural theology is that it's standardly thought of as being the product of the scientific revolution, that you have this sort of enlightenment natural theology that is a kind of theological thinking that is grounded in and motivated by the developments in natural philosophy coincident with the scientific revolution. the narrative is out of the, how can I put this, the kind of tradition and superstition laden theology of the Middle Ages, a kind of shining light of reason is shone upon theological thinking, and that this is this is coincident with the scientific revolution. The standard narrative is that this scientific natural theology is a kind of midpoint, a kind of moment within the development of the scientific revolution, where the theology and the science somehow go together, but that inevitably the science is going to leave the theology behind. So for some of these early scientific natural theologians, people like Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton. Newton, of course, is as concerned with theology as he is with optics and mechanics. In fact, it's the same concern. But anyway, that from Boyle and Newton, the science seems to be coincident with the theology, but then starts to develop a life of its own. And there are some figures who try and hang on, who try and keep theologizing the science. And they are the sort of late 17th, 18th century natural theologians. Key figure, of course, here is William Paley. Paley's 1802 Natural Theology, conveniently called Natural Theology, represents this last-ditch attempt, really, from the theologians to try and bring the science into the theology. And the way that they do that is really by saying that the theology is proved by the science, so that the science shows that God must exist because scientific work reveals the natural world as designed, as therefore in need of a designer. Paley's famous phrase that contrivance requires contriver, design requires designer. The standard story, as I say, is that then that's the kind of high point, and then it's all downhill from there on. And this is because of a fatal three-pronged attack from, firstly, the philosopher David Hume, secondly, the scientist Charles Darwin, and then thirdly, the theologian Karl Barth. And it's widely accepted that the intellectual legitimacy of natural theology basically collapses in the wake of this philosophical, scientific, and theological critique. And then any further attempts at natural theology, at anything like natural theology in the 20th century, are really to be dismissed as fairly desperate attempts of those who are resistant to science to somehow reinstate theology or religious claims against the legitimacy of science. And hence one finds quite common the argument that intelligent design theorists are really updated natural theologians. And I think that's fundamentally mistaken. For a start, intelligent design theorists themselves reject the label of natural theology. And I think they're right to do so, although I think so for different reasons from those that they present themselves. I mean, they present themselves as doing science, not theology. But from my perspective, the point is that they're not doing natural theology precisely because they are not trying to come to conclusions about God and the nature of God on the basis of their scientific work. They're rather trying to trade upon the